it was good. So, but the two things that came up for me as the best fit for me were either teaching or a career in the law. And a legal career was compelling for me because I really liked the idea of its impact. We have, I think, this great legal system, but it's really hard to navigate if you're not a lawyer. So it's a job that I saw being something where you would be really connected to people and, helping people get through the legal system, and just belief in the rule of law. And so that was appealing. And at the time in my life, I really couldn't picture myself as an elementary school or a high school teacher. I just didn't see myself doing that. And the two things I was most not to do were Army Sergeant, which I totally get, and nun. Also interesting. so, which I probably, but anyway, I really, there was something about the law that was appealing, just in terms of the type of work I thought that you would do as a lawyer. And also, I did think, given the things that I was good at in school, which was the frame of reference that I had, that I probably would be a good lawyer. So I went to law school.
You went to law school. How did that confront your view of what you thought law would be?
I did not enjoy law school all that much because it was, you read a gabillion pages a night and you go in and you kind of rehash them all, and then you go do it again the next night. And then there aren't a lot of skills classes. You take an appellate advocacy class, you take a trial advocacy class. Those classes I loved because they were, much more like solving real problems and mimicked sort of real world work. Mm-hmm. But I got tired. College was great because it seemed like every class I took, you approached it in a different way. Mm-hmm. And law school wasn't like that. So I didn't love law school itself that much, but I loved practice. Mm-hmm. The practice of law definitely coincided with what I hoped it would be.
Now, was that after law school or during law school?
So after law school, when I got to work.
So what kept you going if you didn't like law school? Wasn't very. Why didn't you drop out? Why did you keep going?
Because a lot of people will tell you if you love law school, you may not like practice as much, and if you hate law school, you'll probably love practice.
So who told you that?
A lot of law students and recent grads and things. It was a pretty common refrain. Mm-hmm. So I thought, there's hope for me. I don't really love this, so I'm probably going to love practice.
So you look to the people who had gone through it. Mm-hmm. They gave you hope. Mm-hmm. Stick through it. Yeah. It's worth it in the end. Okay. So what kind of law did you practice when you came out?
So I was a litigator, which is trial work. I went to work for a large law firm. And so traditionally there, you're a young associate. You're sort of a bag carrier for a lot of other trial lawyers in the beginning of your career. I went to work for a great firm that I got a lot of responsibility early on. I actually got to do a lot of things that some of my peers at comparable law firms were not getting to do. I got to take a lot of depositions and of pretty significant witnesses. I got to do a lot of really interesting discovery work. But the other reason that I was interested in the firm that I went to work for is because they had a reputation for being particularly supportive of lawyers' interest in doing pro bono work. And that was something that was really important to me. It's a reason a lot of people that went to work for Drinker Biddle were interested in that firm. There were a lot of us there. That was part of the real appeal to going to work there. And I did have the opportunity to do a significant amount of pro bono work while I was there. So it was a pretty ideal place for me.
Now there's a particular case that you worked on, right? That
one of the pro bono matters I worked on took up a disproportionate amount of my time. In fact, I was fortunate as a young associate because I spent an awful lot of time on pro bono work in my first few years, as opposed to even representing paying clients. And I did have a couple of other pro bono matters, but I spent most of my time as one of a team of people representing an inmate on death row in Alabama.
So just really quickly,
proceeding.
Does everybody know what pro bono means when we're referring to it? You're all familiar? Okay. So,
Yeah, so that case had been in-house when I went to work for Drinker. When I started as an associate, case had been in-house for, I think close to a year. And one of the two associates that had persuaded the managing partner to bring the case in-house had left to go to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office. He became a prosecutor for a few years, which opened up his place on the case. So they were looking for someone to fill that slot, and the other associate came down and asked me if I'd be interested in working on it. I was. The partner, interestingly, came to my office the next morning and said, you need to really think about this. I don't want you to just say yes. You have to really understand that you could end up with a client who gets executed. And, it's not your everyday kind of matter. The stakes are really high. I want you to take the briefs. I want you to go home and read them. And I'm going to come back to you in a few days, and I'm going to ask you again. But you need to be really sure.
So really
this
quickly,
is something you want to do.
what are you feeling at this time? This is what you want to do, right? Like, you went into law. Here's your chance to really use the law to help somebody. But you're confronting this, this is much harder than corporate law, right? What are you feeling?
It's certainly very different. And I think, given the nature of the stakes, you like to think that all your cases are important, that you view all your clients' matters as important, and you give them the same attention and standard of care that you would give all the others. But it is definitely a game changer when at the end of the day, it isn't a question of who's going to pay who how much money or whatever, but as to whether you're going to have a client who gets executed. And so I did go home and I did think about it really hard. I did read the briefs, and I did really feel that, and I think initially when we started working on the case, I think the guilt innocence question we weren't 100% sure on, but it was very clear to us that procedurally the case was not right. And that for us to have a system that people can have confidence in and that can be, meaningful, you have to get it right. And that in particular, if you're talking about taking someone's life, you have to get it right. And so I felt like, it's going to be horrible if I have a client who gets executed. So I'm just going to sort of put that over here and, roll up my sleeves with everybody else and work on this case. So that's what we did.
So you took the case.
It was already in-house. Yeah, I just joined the team. Yeah.
That was your choice, right?
Yes.
It wasn't.
Oh, no, I didn't
assigned
have to do
you,
it.
right? You didn't have to do it. So you chose to do it.
Chose to do it.
So can you tell us a little bit about it and what happened?
Yeah, so the events that were in question in the case, 1976, there's a robbery of a grocery store, and the grocery store attendant chases the thief out of the store several blocks into a trailer park, which is dark, not well lit. They're running through the park. There's a lot of confusion as to what happens next. Police are called when gunshots are heard. They arrive on the scene, and the manager of the grocery store has been shot. He's been killed. He's underneath one of the trailers, and they find a man hiding, several hundred yards away. He has a gun that's not been fired. It's not clear the gun's functional, but he's in possession of a gun, and they arrest him. And he goes through a couple of trials. It had a very complicated procedural history, but at the point that we came in, he had been convicted at the state level, exhausted his state appeals, and was hoping to bring a habeas petition for relief in federal court. And we raised a number of claims. We raised a double jeopardy claim. We raised a Batson claim, which is a claim that African-American jurors, our client was African-American, and that African-American jurors had been improperly struck for racial reasons, excluded from a jury, which denied him a jury of his peers and is against the law, so that had been a miscarriage of justice. We also argued ineffective assistance of counsel claims because his trial lawyers didn't research for for the sentencing phase of his case, any of his background present any evidence in mitigation that might have resulted in a prison sentence, but not a capital conviction, not a death sentence. So we were arguing these various claims, pursuing throughout. And one of my big responsibilities was to work on the ineffective assistance of counsel claim and to put together, one of the things you have to prove is that had that evidence been different, there's a reasonable probability that the outcome would have been different. And so we had to actually put on the sentencing phase that we felt could have been presented, many years before in his trial, which meant going back and finding those witnesses and interviewing those witnesses and hiring expert witnesses that could evaluate him and testify to his mental state and his capacities and things like that. And
So really quickly, just so I may understand, are you saying, because I'm not a lawyer, are you saying he had a crappy lawyer first?
No. So one of the big challenges to death penalty litigation, a lot of these convicted people get court-appointed lawyers who don't have experience in capital cases.
Yeah.
And they're overworked, and they're not really experienced in that kind of litigation, and there aren't a lot of funds. They don't get paid very much. So to go out and hire an expert witness who's going to cost thousands of dollars, and there aren't really a lot of funds for that.
Okay.
And so there's a problem, with the way all that works. And there ended up being a tremendous number of inmates on death row, particularly in what they referred to as the Bible Belt in the southern states across that. And there was an American Bar Association project that got started to try to take those inmates and match their cases with law firms that could afford to take on that representation and go back and examine those records and see if something needed to go back and be revisited and try to get the courts to do that. And so this case, our client was in Alabama, we were in Philadelphia, but we were paired with him, and the guys that wanted to bring it in had read the briefs and everything, and that was the case they wanted to take on, and they went to the partner in the firm and said, we want to do this, but you don't get to bring in, you have to have a partner sign off on it.
Right.
And so one of the partners in the firm was willing to sort of oversee that case. And it became, for the whole 6 years that I was at the firm, we were working on the case. We did eventually get a new trial, and that took place in the year right after I left. And he was exonerated, he was released. He lived a very productive subsequent 21 years. And he passed away in July 2 years ago.
You kept in touch with him.
So briefly after he first left, I then did see him several years later. After his release, the partner on the case was being honored for his commitment to pro bono, and he's done a lot of tremendous pro bono work, and he was being honored at a reception at the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and the other team members traveled to Washington to be there, when Ken received that honor, and Bo came up from Alabama. And so I did see him, at that.
So Bo's his name?
His name's Bo. Yep, James.
Your work saved this guy from death row.
Many people's work. I was a member of the team, but yeah, it was probably the most meaningful case that I worked on when I was in practice.
So I think this is so interesting because, again, thinking through what Charlie's saying, we're co-authors in a larger story. I mean, we're talking about Brenda, but you've now just learned about the life of this man, Bo, who did not get justice. And I mean, she described all the different things that had to go into giving this guy justice. Incredibly expensive, right? You're basically saying wasn't a crappy lawyer, just didn't have as many resources to do a decent job of helping this guy out. So one story multiplied by all those other people, multiplied by time. But Bo's story is such a big part of your story. Bo wouldn't have had a story, for your story.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so many people, we ourselves, even though we came from a law firm that could afford to underwrite the cost of litigation in a very different way than his original attorneys could afford to do, we didn't have a lot of any experience. None of us had any experience with this particular kind of case either. And Brian Stevenson, who he's actually recently written a book, and he's been in the news quite a bit lately. But Brian Stevenson was a younger lawyer himself back then. He has devoted his entire life to this kind of work. And we were on the phone with Brian regularly. Morris Dees out of the Southern Poverty Law Center. We tapped a lot of people who had a lot of experience, who were very generous and very supportive. It was sort of, there were other cities in the firms in the city that were also doing these kinds of cases, and we would periodically get together for lunches. And sort of sit in a conference room and sort of say, okay, what kinds of issues is everybody working on? How can we help each other out? What have we learned? What do we know? And so, yeah, it was an effort of a lot.
Even more, yeah.
To try and address these issues. Yeah.
So this is interesting. So we're in your law career, and you're getting to do some really meaningful things.
Yeah.
You're getting great experience, great exposure, but you left law.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Well, I mean, to think that you get to be a part of something that can have an impact like that, and really all my cases, I represented a couple who had taken out a bank loan, and they were paying it back, and they really didn't understand a lot of the ins and outs. They essentially kind of got defrauded by the bank, who kept, rolling things over and telling them they hadn't paid. And, the partner and I that we were working on it, we were able to sort of unravel the whole thing and figure out that, in fact, they had paid it off and, get them off the hook for, you get to help people address major issues in their lives that are overwhelming if you don't understand. I today, even as a former lawyer, there are a whole host of things I would never do without consulting a lawyer because it's so broad.
Yeah.
And there's so many areas of expertise. There's just a whole lot of things that I would never do without consulting a lawyer who specialized in that area. And so, it feels good to be able to help people navigate what's usually, or companies, what's usually a pretty difficult time, to be able to be of service in that way.
You haven't really stopped doing that, have you, though?
What? I don't practice
helping
law.
People. Well, what you're really doing, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Helping people navigate scenarios that they've not been through, or they don't understand.
I think if you look at the different jobs that I've held, I look fairly scattered. Right out of college, I actually was in sales for a few years to help pay my way through law school. Then I was a lawyer, for 6+ years. I left the practice of law and I was home with our children as a stay-at-home mother for many years. Then I went to work in a volunteer capacity, but I had to go to school for a year. I mean, the training was very rigorous, the demands, but in a museum education capacity out at Stanford's Art Museum in California when we were living there. And today I serve on the board of Horizons, which is a program that improves the educational outcomes for students from low-income families by providing quality academic and enrichment opportunities. So I serve on the board there, and I'm the art teacher there. So, again, I think that seems fairly scattered when you look at it, but I think the common thread through all of them is that there actually has been some aspect of teaching in all of them. As a trial lawyer, you're really trying to educate the fact finder as to the facts of the case or the application of law to your case. Raising children certainly has an educational component to it. When you're in sales, you're trying to educate your potential customers as to how your product can be of value or service to them. So there is that thread of commonality that runs through the things that I've done. Yes, I think most of them, because it's been an important thing for me, most of them I've been able to look at and say, here's some way that I'm being of service to someone else in a particular capacity.
Now, do you see that looking backward, or going to the question we have on the cover of the program? You know, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Where are you going?
So I think when I was in college and I was trying to decide what to major in, I think I definitely didn't get the why question right. I knew that I was really fortunate to be able to go to college, that had been a very important thing to my parents. And I wanted to feel like I wasn't going to squander it, that I was going to be a good student, and I was going to make good use of this great opportunity to have this education. And I really was very career oriented. I wanted to have a career. I wanted to work. I was looking forward to doing it. I really liked school, and I really wanted to have a career. I just didn't know what that should be.
But why did you want a career?
Because I just was drawn to the idea of work. I liked the idea of work, of doing something productive. I thought it sounded great, whatever it was. And so, but the things that I loved in college, English literature, art history, were all things that sort of got but what are you going to do with that? This concept of like, that's not marketable. And I sort of had this feeling of, will I be squandering this great opportunity, like in my family narrative of, wow, I'm one of these few in my family that gets to come to college. You really don't want to disappoint everybody by squandering it on being an English major. So the theory was, if you're not an engineering type, and I'm so not a science or an engineering person, I think it's the beauty of the world and creation that there's people who are good at everything, right? And that's so not me. So those were not going to be options for me. I had no aptitude in those areas, and those kind of marketable majors where the minute you said it, you kind of knew what that person was going to do. Those did not apply to me. So the theory among those of us in school at the time, all sort of talking about it, was that econ was kind of a liberal, wasn't really wholly a business major, but it was the closest to the business major. It was, you're an econ major. You weren't an English major, you were an econ major. So I was an econ major. So, the problem with that is, if you're an econ major and you choose that because it's going to make you more marketable, only for jobs you'd hate. I mean, I don't know what I thought I was going to do with it that was going to be a good fit for me, or where I was really going to be able to deploy any talents or gifts or skills that I had. It was kind of a dumb choice. It was not my best moment. So there I was. I graduated with this double major in economics and sociology because I'd taken some social classes, and my advisor said to me, you're close enough and there's some overlap and you could get that degree really easily, and if one is good, two is better. That'll look so much better if you're a double major. Again, it's not the kind of work I wanted to do. So I had this double major in economics and sociology that I graduated with. That I really didn't have any enthusiasm for using. But I did think I really wanted to go to law school, and I was excited about that, and I knew that I needed to earn some money to help me be able to pay for that. So I started applying for jobs, and one of the things that I was qualified to do was to be a sales rep. And while I wasn't really excited about that, it also, compared to some other things that I was qualified to do, was probably going to enable me to make the most and save the most money to help me pay for law school. So I went into sales for close to 4 years before going back to school, which was another whole dogleg in my life of, odd jobs that I've held. Because I didn't really love the sales job.
Yeah.
But I learned so much from it that I look back on now. When you say, did you know then, or did you, I look back now And I say, that's what I learned from that, and that's what I learned from that. And I actually, in what I'm doing now, that I do draw on that. And I'm 56 years old. I can look back over my life so far now and see this arc in it, where it's all been used for good. It's all been worthwhile. I haven't liked all of it in the same way, but I have been able to feel that I've been of service to people in some way in everything that I've done. And I have, when I needed to earn money, I've been able to earn the money that I needed to do to pay my way. And it's just funny to look back on your life as you get older and have those aha moments where you sort of say, oh, maybe there is a plan that's somewhere down there, that I'm sort of working along towards, thinking I'm making these choices and whatever, but it kind of does all hang together in the end in an absorbing sort of puzzle, but it does.
Where is it heading?
So, it's an interesting thing because in the last several years, we've moved quite a bit. And so I've done a lot as our daughters have gotten older and more independent, and I've had more time, I've sort of gone back to more formal kinds of training for things and taking on commitments that are more like jobs outside of the home. And I sort of will get through the training and really start hitting my stride in something, and we move. And it's happened, just a couple of times. And I think the interesting thing is that as I've moved through my life and had more and more of a revelation, if you will, it's not, when I was in college, I was choosing, I think I thought more of my major and my job as sort of an identity marker. Brenda Holston, sales rep. Oh, I don't want to be that. Brenda Holston, lawyer. Okay, I want to be a lawyer. But I look at it now and I see, someone said to me once, you've reinvented yourself many times. And I thought for a while, okay, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I guess that's kind of true. I have sort of reinvented myself over and over. But more recently, I look at it, and I don't think that's true. I don't think it's that I've reinvented myself. Mm-hmm. I think I'm the same person. I think that what I've done is I've found different ways to use whatever gifts and talents I've been given in service of others and benefit of myself. Whatever our family needed or I needed, things that have been fulfilling to me, but that have also, hopefully, been of some service to other people. And so it's really, there's something kind of freeing in that, because you realize there's a whole host of things you can do. It doesn't really matter what you majored in. It doesn't really matter what your last job was. What matters is, what are your experiences? What are your gifts? What are your talents? What are your skills? If you look at the content of what you're going to do day to day in a given job, you can do a lot of things, whether you've ever held a job that had that title or not. And that was kind of cool when I realized that, because all of a sudden I was like, I can go in somewhere and I can say, you really need an art teacher? I have never been an art teacher in my life, but I can learn it. I can be a good one, and you need one. And sometimes people go, okay. But that you aren't necessarily identified. You are not what your job is. Your job is what you do.
You probably struggled with that quite a bit, right? I mean, who doesn't struggle with thinking about identity and job? Do you have a question? Yes. You struggle with that. I struggle with that.
And I think when I stepped out of the practice of law,
yeah,
to stay home full time, with then our first child, we hadn't had our second child yet, I was very clear that that was what I wanted to do. but there was still a whole transitional period where that was a very challenging transition, because all of a sudden I quote unquote didn't have any job. And I can remember the first morning, Mike left for work. My husband's name is Mike. Mike left for work. He's almost always up and out early. Sarah was never a sleeper when she was little. So we were typically up from about 2 to 4:30 in the morning. She was very cheerful, but she needed company. And so we were sort of in this very bad habit, and I was not a good Ferberizer of our baby where you just let them cry. And so anyway, we were up from 2 to 4:30 in the morning very regularly, and then I would go back to bed. And more importantly, Sarah would go to sleep. So Mike would be leaving for work at about 6, and the house would be quiet. And I remember that first day laying there and thinking, oh my God, like I totally wanted to do this, but oh my God, I don't have a job, I don't have a title, I don't have a paycheck, it was a very radical shift for me in terms of how I'd ever identified myself, it was the first time since I'd been in high school that I didn't have a job. So it was.
But what's interesting is I've talked to some women who've made this choice, right? Where you feel like, okay, somebody's got to stay home. It's cheaper than the nanny, and they get in that position, right? But usually what I hear is they say, what a relief. I can just do whatever I want. I get my life back. You sound like you were frustrated with that.
I don't think I was not frustrated, because it really was my choice to be home, and I was happy to be home. But there's still that transition that is, even when you go out in the world, there's adjusting to the way the world sees you. You're now going to functions with your husband, who's still a lawyer, and you're around all these people who are working, and you're meeting them, and they're lovely, and they're nice, and they say to you, what do you do? And you say, I'm at home with our daughter. And you watch their face go, oh, who else can I talk to? Because I don't want to hear about the sandbox, and I don't want to hear about it, and you see it. I can remember going to the store one day to buy something, and paying with my credit card, which was an American Bar Association issued credit card. And the guy behind the counter saying, oh, ABA, what does that stand for? And I said, it's the American Bar Association. He said, oh, your husband must be a lawyer. And I said, he is. He is. But it's just that dealing with the fact that the world sees you differently, depending on what you do. And it's not just, it's all jobs, right? It's some jobs are seen as more valuable than others. And it's true of a whole lot of categories of things, not just, whether you're an at-home parent. And so it's just a paradigm shift in that sense. But I will say, it was very important for me to remind myself consistently, I know why I'm doing this, and it is my choice, and I am excited about it, and none of the rest of that matters, because my identity isn't wrapped up in what I'm doing for a living. It doesn't matter what that person's reaction to what I am doing is, as long as I know my reason for doing it, and it fits in with my narrative, I'm good.
So you're able.
I'm sorry?
How did you know why?
How did I know why?
Yeah, you were confident in your definition of why. How were you confident?
In which instance? That I wanted to come home?
You said that you knew why you were doing it.
That I wanted to come home. So I tried going back to work right after Sarah was born. I worked part-time for about 6 or 8 months. And I found, first of all, that meant Sarah was in daycare, and she was sick a lot in the beginning. And just before her first birthday, she landed in the hospital with something pretty serious for a few days. And I can remember way before the days of cell phones and, standing next to her hospital bed, on the telephone, picking up my messages, thinking, okay, I have to call these clients, I've got to do this stuff. She's, got this IV in her and, it's not a great situation. And thinking for the first time, I don't care enough about my clients. I'm wherever I am, I'm dropping the ball. When I'm at work, I'm dropping the ball with her. When I'm with her, I'm dropping the ball at work. That's how I felt. And I do think we all have to sort of come to terms with what our own bandwidth is. And I recognized that mine was not going to be sufficient to do both of those jobs at a standard that I was going to be happy with and felt was fair and adequate to either job. And my priority, easily and far and away, was her. That was an easy decision for me. And Mike and I talked about it because, the other thing is you're going from 2 incomes to 1. So, we had a conversation about that. And I really wanted to be home full-time with her. Mike is an extraordinary dad. He's not wired to be home all the time. I was surprised that I turned out to be wired to be home all the time, to be honest with you. In my earlier years, if you had told me that, I probably would not have thought that would be the case. So you never know how your circumstances will change in life or how you'll respond to different things. But so, we bet on Mike's career, and I came home full time, and that became my purview, all things at home and day to day with the kids during the week when he was at work, and that for the period of time until, like I said, the girls got much older. That's how our family has worked.
So we've talked a lot about, how you've made these kinds of decisions. You took a lot of inputs in, whether it was your circumstances, and it sounds like a lot of it was who really needed you, to whom could you provide additional services. Where does your faith fit in all this?
So, I think you said, most people relieved to be out of work. Why did I want to work? Why did I? I've always found it interesting. And then I read, and it came at a really timely moment for me too, about 6 or 7 years ago. There was a book published by Timothy Keller called Every Good Endeavor. And he talks about this issue, work, and sort of what is the Christian view of work and where does it fit in. And it resonated with me right away because I have always been struck that right out of the gate in Genesis, one of the first things the Bible talks about is work. God creating the world, this creative aspect of work, and that we are designed for work. It is a really important part of who we are. He gives us these jobs and we're designed for work. And throughout the Bible, you see things that say that, we're given various gifts and talents for deployment in the world for good. And so that's always been really interesting to me. It's, that I think work fits in with my faith. But I think work can take a lot of forms. It can look like a lot of things. Even if Sarah had not been sick a lot, I think that really brought it home for me. I would have made that shift. I look back and I know I was not going to be satisfied if I had the opportunity with someone else being home with our children that much, if I could be home with them. That was the job that I most wanted to do at that time. But it is, if the Bible says all work has dignity. It doesn't matter what your job is. And so I've always sort of viewed work as a positive thing. I have had jobs I did not like at all. But I have learned an awful lot about myself from working. I do think it's one of the key ways we figure out what our gifts and talents are, and where we can be meaningful in the world. And I think my faith fits in to the extent that I think we're wired for work. I think it's part of the way we're made. I think it's finding the work that we're suited for, the work that fits in, with our narrative and with the larger narrative of the world. It's finding the right work. And there are a whole lot of things that sometimes you're not in the best job, sometimes you are. There are a lot of factors that impact it. But I think work has a pretty exalted start in the Bible. I mean, I think it's a good thing.
Whose work?
God's work in creating, and then God's work in creating us and hardwiring us for work. I don't think work has to be just a necessary evil, just a means to earning money to pay bills and take a vacation. Mm-hmm. I think it can do those. I think that's a huge part of why we all work, obviously, and those are important things. I think work does that. But I think work can be a lot more than that.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking through again the keynote and what Charlie started, right? He said,
Charlie knocked it out of the park.
Totally. I can't say it enough times.
Yeah.
But in particular, he started out talking about why values as a framework are so poor, right? And because look at values, right? Your college said art history is not valuable, English is not valuable, right? And that forced you into a path that it forced you into their values, right? And the same is true for, are you maximizing your full potential? You're a lawyer,
And I've had people say that to me.
Yeah.
Don't you think that's a waste of your law school education? Uh-huh. And, now you guys are far enough, you could have hired a nanny later. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't you don't you think that's a waste? And I'm like, do I think being home with my children every day? No, I do not think that's a waste. That I don't.
But you had a compass. You were going to do God's work. And God's work has led you through very crooked, weird, different paths, right? Paths you wouldn't necessarily have expected through different places. But in each instance that you've talked to us about, you've always been doing work. Mm-hmm. You've never stopped working, really.
I think we're all working all the time. And it depends on how you're defining the word work.
Yeah.
But if you're making dinner, if you're cleaning the house, if you're cutting the grass, it's a form of work. A lot of life is work. Mm-hmm. And so I think that how you view it, what your perspective on it is sort of really important to the quality of your life.
How did you keep that perspective? I would find that really hard to constantly think, to think even in like cutting the grass, I'm doing God's work versus doing something that's maximizing. How did you keep that? You had a lot of pressures, a lot of probably women who were asking, why are you staying home? How did you keep going in that direction? You were going to do God's work. How did you keep that focus?
Well, you're kind, but let's not give me too much credit, because there have been many days when I was in the sales job or where I was not thinking, yay, I'm doing God's work. These are things that you look back on, or that that you see, from a little bit more of a distance. That you step back periodically and sort of look at the big narrative and take stock of those things. When I went into sales, first of all, I just was not comfortable with the idea of trying to sell people things. So it was going to be a hard job. And I went to work for a company that sold business and information systems, hardware and software, turnkey proprietary computer systems to businesses in the automotive aftermarket, which means I called on auto parts store owners, mom and pop auto parts store shops. Not a comfort zone for me. I don't know really anything about cars. That is a very male-dominated field. If there are women in the building, they're the bookkeepers upstairs, or at least back when I was, working in that industry, they were. And I had a credibility issue with the men who own those businesses because they knew I didn't know anything about cars. And even though I didn't need to know a lot about cars to understand the computer and how it could help their business, they saw, you just came out of school and I looked like it, and you don't know anything about cars, and you're asking me to make one of the single biggest investments in my business I'm ever going to make. aside from the value of my inventory and the bricks and mortar building I own, a $50,000 or $100,000 computer is a huge investment, and I really don't want to talk to you. And I did not like that job. It was hard every day. But the way I finally had to look at it was to say, okay, I have to do this job to make this money so that I can go to law school and get a job I like. So how am I going to get through, this next few years? And I have to stop saying, I'm hearing my mom and, solve the problem. I have to stop feeling sorry for myself that I have this terrible job that I go to every day.
Your dad, PMA.
Yeah, my dad's saying, positive mental attitude, wins the day. So I'm like, okay, how do I carry that narrative out, as a good member of the Williams family? And I did start to recognize that I really did think this product could make a huge difference in these people's businesses. At the time, none of you can remember. I don't think you were alive when there was a time when there wasn't all this automation. But these businesses that I was calling on had thousands of pieces of inventory. It's a huge asset for them. Most of their money in their business is wrapped up in these hundreds and hundreds of replacement parts for cars. And they track them on 3x5 index cards. And so you would go to the counter to buy something, and they would go back and look for it, and somebody would make a little note on a thing. And picture that. That is so, now it's laughable, right? It's hard to even imagine, but that's how they did business. And that's how they were trying to control this huge asset that they had. And they couldn't run any instantaneous reports that said, here's your fast movers. Here's where you're really making money. These are sitting on the shelf for X amount of time. You should send half of those back to the warehouse. They didn't have the capacity to do any of that. And I had the ability to go in and say to them, look, you're right. I don't know the first thing about cars. I just did that really stupid example for you where I said your customer comes in and they want to buy a spark plug. And I lost you completely because you're like, no one buys one spark plug. They don't work that way. It doesn't happen. It's twos or fours or, so I had to just start saying to people, look, I'm going to probably say something really stupid now because I'm going to give you an example and I don't really understand cars and I don't really understand that part of your business. But I do understand how this computer works, so bear with me, just humor me, and let's go through this example, and, let's go. And I started being able, by focusing on how that product could actually be of service and really transform their businesses and be helpful to them, I was able to find a way to find some common ground with them and talk about it. And I also learned, because I held one other sales job briefly, that was a very short cycle. You went in, you were calling on doctors. If you got to see them at all, you had 3 minutes while they were walking down the hall. And this sales cycle was long. It was at least a 6-week cycle. You went back over and over again. You were meeting with people. It wasn't we order that every 2 weeks and the person at the front desk can place it with you. You don't even really need to see. The owner was going to make this decision. It was a huge investment. And I learned that as between those two different kinds of jobs, that longer sales cycle, that much more personal relationship, that much more significant decision in their business was a much more appealing process for me. I was better at it, and I liked it more. At time, I got to the point where I just liked doing it more. And it became a much more palatable job than it had started out being. But again, it was turning it around and saying, okay, this has to be part of my story, but how can part of my story also help somebody else? Mm-hmm. And it worked better.
So, yes, please.
That was an amazing story you just told. And I'm sorry, but I have this computer in my pocket. and when you said all work has dignity, I went, guess who said that? It's not the Bible. It's Martin Luther King. It is to the sanitation workers in Memphis. And then, I look in my, Wikipedia feed or whatever, and it's like 10 biblical verses on work. Because you're talking so much about work. And it's interesting, aside from Proverbs, there's not like straight up Bible verses about work. And Genesis is really the story about how God made this thing so that actually he could get the Sabbath there, so we could actually rest. And there's all these other verses that talk about whatever you do,
Do it well.
I do it well, and you're just such an exemplification of that. You figured out by living your life how to work to the glory of God and how work would become meaningful, because that's why work is meaningful, because a job's a job. Thank you.
Oh. I'm delighted if it was meaningful.
Thank you as well too. I'm on a very similar path and very similar age. You described work as an employee, a volunteer, and a mother.
Mhm.
Have you worked as a daughter?
Yes. Fortunately, although it seemed interminably long, the very end of my father's life was not, his decline was sort of a couple of months and particularly bad the last few weeks. And I definitely was there and worked in that capacity. My mother is living and I think potentially has more energy than I do. She's doing great. So we have a great relationship. She doesn't require, she's very independent and doing very well. So she doesn't require that kind of work. She and I actually enjoy one another quite a bit. But I know a lot of people who have had much longer term work supporting parents, and my husband's mother, she was in a slower decline for a couple years when we first moved back from California to Pennsylvania, and we were a little more involved in that process with her. So yeah, I mean, I think there's so many capacities in which we work, and sometimes I think our culture really favors or tends to value more, the professions and and I think what I was thinking in terms of the Bible, in terms of the dignity of work, thinking about Genesis, God, Adam, they're gardening. Jesus came into the world as a carpenter. There's dignity in all forms of work, and whether it states that explicitly or you're reading it, between the lines I think it's in there. And so I think that for me, I am happiest if I'm doing a job that I think I'm good at, that is meeting whatever the needs of my life in the moment are, but also serving other people, and hopefully maybe serving the work too, maybe doing something that benefits the field. In a perfect world, that's what you get to do. Every day's not perfect, but sometimes you get to do that. So.
How are we doing on time? Done? Can I end with one quote? Okay. I hope this was an encouraging discussion. I would just want to end with a quote that I thought was really helpful. It actually comes from, the citation is first and foremost from Greg, and secondarily from G.K. Chesterton. If our life is ever really as beautiful as a fairy tale, we shall have to remember that all the beauty of a fairy tale lies in this, that the prince has a wonder which just stops short of being fear. If he is afraid of the giant, there is an end of him. But also, if he is not afraid of the giant, there is an end of him. The whole point depends upon his being at once humble enough to wonder and haughty enough to defy. So our attitude to the giant of the world must not merely be increasing delicacy or increasing contempt. It must be one particular proportion of the two, which is exactly right. We must have in us enough reverence for all things outside us to make us tread fearfully on the grass. English. We must also have enough disdain for all things outside us to make us, on due occasion, spit at the stars. Yet these two things, if we are to be good or happy, must be combined, not in any combination, but in one particular combination. The perfect happiness of men on earth, if it ever comes, will not be a flat and solid thing like the satisfaction of animals. It will be an exact and perilous balance, like that of a desperate romance. Man must have just enough faith in himself to have adventures, and just enough doubt of himself to enjoy them. Thank you.